Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, everybody. I am absolutely thrilled that we get to hear now from one of my beloved teachers and friends, Arnie Eisen. So you're going to hear in a moment a little bit of Arnie's formal biography. But what I want to tell you about him, I think, is more important than all of the accolades and all of the degrees and all of the books, which is really the decency, the curiosity, and the fundamental goodness of the scholar that sits before us in this room today. Arnie, I don't know how to go, Dr. Chancellor?
Arnie.
Okay, I keep tripping up on this. I can't. Dr. Arnie Eisen was actually the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary starting in the year 2007. And before that was a beloved scholar at Stanford University, and I think has many friends and fans in the community here who were beloved students. But Professor Eisen became chancellor and served in that capacity until about 5 years ago, when he returned to the capacity of being in the classroom full-time as a member of the JTS faculty. Aside from really writing some of the most important thought pieces, both in book form and in essay form, that have really shaped, I would say, 21st century American Jewry, what I want to share with you, and Aaron Bisman was here earlier today, and I think is up on this rooftop today too. What I want to share with you is what happened in between the time that Chancellor Eisen was named chancellor and then actually moved to New York to step into the role. So this was a time in which I imagine your hands were full with a very heavy full course load at Stanford and learning an entirely new system at the seminary, my alma mater. And in the midst of all of that, one day in April, I got a call from Professor Arnie Eisen who said, I heard about what's going on at IKAR. It sounds interesting. We were, by the way, 3 years old at that time, so pretty new. I would love for you to come up to Stanford. Let's sit together. I'm stepping into this role as chancellor, and I want to know the people who are thinking in different ways about what Jewish community looks like in the 21st century. Okay, if that doesn't seem like a very big deal to you, then I need to just tell you one more piece of background, which is starting a community like IKAR, or a project like HEB, or running Progressive Jewish Alliance, or running Hadar, some of the other experiments in Jewish life that were just starting to get off the ground in the early days of the 2000s, were not exactly embraced by the institutional Jewish world. Very often, in fact, we were seen as kind of competition to the old way, to the establishment structure. And all of a sudden, this person who was stepping into the halls of power as the chancellor of this storied institution, reached out beyond those walls and said, let's see what we can learn together. I want to be in conversation with you. And that's not all. Chancellor Eisen then went on to move to New York City with ACE and went on to become chancellor, step into this leadership role, and then reached back out a year later and said, you know what? Let's make this a yearly gathering. And so every year for some amount of years, we gathered together, all the kind of radicals, experimenters, risk takers, in their living room now in New York City, and just talked about what was in our hearts and what we dreamed to be possible for the Jewish people. And that was really exciting and wonderful for me, and I hope I brought back some of that excitement to share with our community here in LA. But what it really did was it taught me what real leadership looks like. This is a person who, for all of his scholarship and all of his wonderful achievements in the world, is constantly seeking, is always wondering, is always curious about what's happening and where can I learn. And I believe that that is actually at the heart not only of the way that you live and teach in the world, but also your theology. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so excited to now bear witness to this conversation with one of the great teachers of our generation, Rabbi Morris Panitz, in conversation with one of my dearest teachers, whose voice and whose wisdom have so shaped the reality that we are all so blessed to be a part of. So thank you so much for being here with us at IKAR. You're home away from home in Los Angeles now, and thank you, Rabbi Panitz, for leading us in this conversation.
All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. I think it's, I'm going to state my intention around time, which is always a risky thing to do as a rabbi. But my intention is to ask Dr. Eisen some questions based on my reading of his book, but then, importantly, open up the floor so that you all have a chance to ask him some questions as well. I suspect that whether or not you've had a chance to read this book, Seeking the Hiding God, and I hope you will, that what you'll hear today will bubble up some questions and curiosities that you have that you can then pose to Dr. Eisen. I'd spent some time looking at your bibliography, Dr. Eisen, which is quite long and quite accomplished and has a lot to do, much of it, with the sociology of American Judaism. A lot on Jewish thought as well, but you are one of the leading experts on sociology of American Judaism. And this book that you've written is, in your words, your first published work of theology. So I want to open with the question, why did you decide at this moment in life to endeavor to write a book on theology? And if you would speak a little bit about the way that you wrote it and the format of the book, which conveys some important lessons as well, I think.
Okay, thanks. First, let me say what a joy it is to be here, and so many old friends and kids of old friends who are now grown-ups with kids of their own. It's really a joy. I want to confess, I asked Morris to ask me that question. The rest of our dialogue is unscripted, and I told him I did not want to know what he would ask me.
But didn't I ask it so naturally?
But you asked it so beautifully.
Thank you.
So I give you a lot of credit for that. So the short answer is because I couldn't avoid it any longer. You know, I'm not the only one in the room, I'm sure, who's lived with a sense that there's something you really should be doing that you're working hard to avoid doing. And I had the sense for several years at least, as I was being chancellor of JTS, that I owed it to myself and my friends and my kids and my students that they should know what I actually believed about the subjects that I'd been teaching for nearly 50 years. I've been reading other people's Jewish thought and making little notes to myself. I believe this, I believe that, this argument is persuasive, this argument is not persuasive. But I never forced myself to give an account of my own belief and non-belief. And I think, like many others in my position, I was afraid what I would find out. Like, I was afraid I would find out that I did not believe as much as I wanted to believe. And Sharon well knows that there's a tradition for chancellors at the Jewish Theological Seminary to run away from the subject of theology at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Some of our great chancellors did not want to speak about it, starting with Solomon Schechter. So I realized that I had to do this, and then when I had my sabbatical year, I couldn't complain that I was working 12-hour days anymore. I was on sabbatical, and it was lockdown, it was COVID, and I was approaching 70, and other people in this room I see have probably passed that milestone as well. And you start looking at time differently. You don't assume anymore that you have all the time in the world. So if there's something you should be doing, now is the time to do it. And I really wanted, especially, that my kids should know what their father thought about Judaism. The joy of giving this talk today at IKAR is that both of those kids are here. But in order to tell them what their father thought about Judaism, their father had to figure out for himself what he thought about Judaism. And so I found myself writing this book. Okay, then the second part of Morris's question was, and you should be asking yourself this as I speak, like, if you decided to do a version of this, what are the elements, what are the guidelines that you would follow? And the first one was that it would be personal. After writing all these scholarly books, I didn't want to write another scholarly book. I did not want to write a book about Judaism. I didn't want to write a book about modern Judaism, which is my field. I didn't want to say the 10 great modern Jewish thinkers are. I wanted to write from the heart and the mind together. And to do that, I realized I had to share some personal experiences. And so the book is not exactly a memoir, but I tell stories that are revealing to me and to the reader about why I think the way I do. I'll talk more about this if you ask me in a few moments. But what I found I wanted to do, I had to speak honestly. And this is really hard. You're writing a book about Judaism. You want Jews to care as much about Judaism as you do. But I wanted to write not a word more than I could stand behind, but also not a word less. And if you were in shul and heard the quote that Morris read from the book about love, that was something that I had to work hard to enable myself to say, because I, like other Jewish thinkers, don't speak well about love. But Shai Held wrote this book, and he had a very similar experience to mine about Jews saying, oh, I thought Christians speak about love. Jews don't speak about love. And so I had to speak about love. And that's part of the personal quality of the book, saying not more than I could say, but also not less than I could say. Then I saw, I'm in the midst of history. And if you've heard the sermon, Sharon's words today, here we are again in a lot of history that we wish we weren't living through. And I was writing in the midst of COVID. I'm a professor of 20th century Jewish thought, and 20th century Jewish thought is dominated by Jewish history. What does it all mean? How could the Holocaust happen? How is God responsible for the state of Israel, et cetera, et cetera? And I was writing in the midst of COVID and George Floyd and all the other stuff going on in the United States, so I realized that had to be in the book. The third issue I faced was, one of the wonderful things about Judaism is the multitude of voices that we have in every major Jewish text. The Siddur is not a creed. Other religions go to church, they have creeds, right? We have an anthology. We have literally hundreds of images of God in the Siddur. And you read the Torah, the book of Leviticus is not the book of Deuteronomy. Those are two different consciousnesses. And of course, the Talmud, the Zohar. Judaism is full of a multitude of voices. And I didn't want the voice of a 70-year-old male to be the only voice in my book. There had to be women's voices in the book. There had to be younger people's voices in the book. There had to be challengers in the book. And so I hit on the idea, first of all, because it helped me find my voice, to write a series of letters to good friends of mine. And then, because these are good friends who disagree with me about the subject of God and theology, I wrote letters back to me from them in their voices. So the book begins with my voice, but also with their voices, and I follow their voices and hope that the reader follows their voices throughout the book. So it's not just me who's speaking, but a whole bunch of people. And finally, I realized, because I have a cousin who I'm very close to, who told me that she has a problem reading books by Jewish thinkers because they're incomprehensible to her. And this is my field. And I know that a lot of the books I read, I have to struggle through. You need more than a PhD to get through them. You need, right? And I decided I had to write a book that my cousin could read. And 3 weeks ago, I had dinner with her, and I asked her, and she said, yes, I understood your book. And I felt, yes, I did it. I wrote a book. But there's a serious point beyond this, which is, if Maimonides is right, and we all owe Maimonides a great debt, certainly I do, I should not be writing this book if I don't have a PhD in physics and mathematics and metaphysics, and I should not be having the chutzpah to say a word about God. And I agree with Rambam that we know very little about God. That's the premise of the book. That's why it's called Seeking the Hiding God, and it's a personal theological essay. I'm just sharing what I think I've learned in my years of life. But we can't follow Rambam and keep silent. We're commanded, after all, and privileged to love the Lord our God with all our heart, all our soul, and all our might. So how are we supposed to begin to fulfill this commandment if there's nothing we can say about God? So there was a moment when I decided I can't let my ignorance and the fact that don't have God available on a regular basis, but just have glimpses. I can't let that stop me. There's one verse, I'll end with this, Morris, because I know we want to have other things beside me answering this one question. I love the Ashrei prayer, and there's a line in there which says, the Lord is near to all who call upon God, to all who call upon God in truth. And my experience was not that God was near to me. So I had to conclude, if that verse is right, I must be doing it wrong. If I were more pious and more learned or devoted more time to this or prayed more, maybe I would find God available. But then I started looking at the number of great Jewish thinkers for whom God was not available. And especially Nachman of Bratslav, who you know considered himself the tzaddik of his generation, and he basically says, I'm the tzaddik of my generation, and God is not present for me, God is absent from me. So it must be that God's not here. And that gave me a lot of comfort and gave me chizuk. I decided if Nachman of Bratslav can write that, then I should be able to write with all my hesitations, with all my ignorance, just write what I can write and share it, and maybe it would help me and help other people too.
The personal nature of your book comes through in the letters that the book begins with, in the letter that the book concludes with, which is a beautiful letter, a love letter, if I may say, to your wife. But as you said, throughout the book, which is peppered with all sorts of personal stories, I want to pick up on the very last thing you said, which is about sort of the honesty of writing a book of theology when so much of your experience of God is a God who is hard to find, or a God who doesn't feel as close or available as you might want. And of course, it's in the title of your book, Seeking the Hiding God, and the notion of God hiding is one of the central themes of your book. Now, I have children ages 8, 5, and 20 months, which means that I'm playing a lot of hide and seek in my life. So it was very resonant for me to hear you using this imagery because I have real experiential knowledge of this game. That is my expertise today, folks. So here's my reflection on the game of hide and seek that I would love for you to comment on from a theological perspective. The joy of hide and seek, there's joy in the seeker, for the seeker, and there's joy for the one who hides. But the game falls apart for one of two reasons. The seeker doesn't actively pursue well enough the person who's hiding and isn't putting any effort into finding the person who's hiding. Or the game falls apart if the person who hides hid too well. And you're looking and you're looking and you're looking and you can't find the person. I've noticed with my kids, and this was truer when they were even younger than they are now, that almost immediately after they hid, they would go peep, 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 right? They want it to be found. And they want it to be found quickly, and they want it to be found fully. Using this language, which you use throughout your book, I guess the beginning of the question would be, what does it mean to you when you describe God as hiding? And how do you understand the balance of who is seeking, who is hiding, how easy it is to be found, and how hard it might be to be found?
Yeah, so first let me say that a teacher of mine used the phrase presiding presence. It's a lovely phrase. The presiding presence of this book is Abraham Joshua Heschel, whom I got to meet when I was a 20-year-old student. I interviewed him for the Daily Pennsylvanian, and he changed my life. Heschel was very fond of this imagery of hiding and seeking, and he got it from his Hasidic ancestors, and it goes way back in Jewish thought. I discovered, maybe it was deep in my recesses of consciousness, after I wrote the book and titled the book, there's actually a chapter in Heschel's book, Man is Not Alone, called The Hiding God. Heschel and other Jewish theologians used it mostly when they were talking about the Holocaust. How do we explain the Holocaust? We can't. We say there's hester panim, there's a hiding of God's countenance. But Heschel liked to say that it's true that God is hiding from us, but it's also true to say that we don't seek well enough. And we also hide a lot when we are sought. And many of you know the title of Heschel's great book, God in Search of Man. So God seeks us, and we're often not there. And I, who grew up singing show tunes from Broadway, I'm fond of the line in My Fair Lady where Eliza's father said, right, the Lord above made man to help his neighbor, right? But when he comes around, you won't be home, right? When the neighbor comes around and needs your help, you got to hope you won't be home. And confessing, I'm often not there when people are seeking me, when people I love are seeking me, or others are seeking me, and perhaps God is seeking me and I'm hiding too. So when we're blaming God for not being there when we seek, we got to make sure that we're available when we're being sought. So part of what I'm doing in this book, that's why the title, you're right, I think it's very important that Jews keep this tradition of ours alive in the world. That's basic. Torah must be kept alive in the world. We have important things to say to the world and do in the world. And it's very difficult for many Jews to engage with this tradition fully because they have totally understandable problems with the God who is on every page of our prayer books and in the Torah. And God is not always a positive feature of Judaism. God chases a lot of Jews away from Judaism. And there are a lot of Jews, maybe some in this room, who are here despite all the God language, despite all the claims about God that we make. And that's understandable. And as a professor of Jewish thought, who's been teaching now in universities for almost 50 years, I'm used to having soulful conversations with people for whom this is an issue. And it takes a while to get used to it and realize that the rabbis who gave us the Siddur and so much else a couple thousand years ago made the decision, which I'm grateful for, that we're going to address God in second person singular. I wish we did it not only with male pronouns, right? And I'm hopeful that the current culture of ours is going to give us gender-neutral personal pronouns. I'm looking forward to that. It's going to help our prayer book a lot to have personal pronouns that are gender-neutral. We don't have them right now. So it's either Baruch Atah or Baruch At. But even though we don't know what God is like, we can't possibly know what God is like, we have this benefit, this blessing of being able to speak to God and cry out to God and say thanks to God, all as if we were talking to a person. And that, which I've just called a great blessing, is for many people an obstacle they can't get past. And so I wanted to write the book naming that and like talking about that and showing how I get past it in the hope that it'll be useful to somebody else as well.
Part of what you just expressed there, which I found myself both in amazement and fighting against while I was reading your book, is what you just expressed about what is unknown. And you said it in your first answer, that part of the premise of your theology is that there is so much that is necessarily unknown. There's this great mystery. And I found myself throughout, wondering how you developed comfort with that fact, right? Because what is unknown, this desire for certainty, this desire for clarity. I mean, you even wrote, right, the question for you has never been whether or not God exists, but rather whether, where, and how God can be found, right? So how did you develop a certain comfort with what is necessarily unknown about God? And how do you develop a relationship, or how do you have a relationship with what is in so many ways unknown?
Yeah, there's no formula for this. And I'm witnessing the mode of Jewish thought that I'm in, which I think is common to a lot of contemporary Jewish thought, is I'm not persuading, I'm sharing, I'm witnessing, I'm not preaching. And your question, I think, is not one that admits of a general answer. It's not that there's a general rule about how you get comfortable with this. But with me, it took time, the same way it took time for me to be able to write these things that I wrote and to speak about love and to talk about death as I do in this book. It took a certain number of years and experiences, and I got there. One of the things that helped me was that the great climactic moment in Heschel's book, Man is Not Alone, which I taught 2 weeks ago at JTS, is the end of chapter 9. Heschel describes a personal experience with God. And the very next page is a chapter called Doubts. Doubts. And it took me a while to realize what the rabbis were doing when they ordered the Jewish calendar such that every year, right before Rosh Hashanah, the portion of the Torah we read is Nitzavim. And in chapter 29, verse 28 of Deuteronomy, you have the verse that means everything to me, absolutely everything, which says the Nistarot, the same word for hiddenness, the mysteries belong to God, but the Niglot, the revealed things, are given to us and our children to do all the words of this Torah. So what you most want to know in life, the Torah is telling you, the Torah, Moses, who knows more than anybody else, the Torah is telling you, you can't know, you're never going to know, it's not known, it's not knowable. What is God ultimately like? What happens after we die? Why is there evil? Why is history so bad? You can't know. But there's so much work for you to do, and you have the tools that you need to do it. I say, not only comically, but half seriously, that this lesson was reinforced for me as a college student by the Rolling Stones. Who's got the line? You can't, and this means everything to me. You can't always get what you want. No, you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you just might find that you get what you need. And I think that is chapter 29, verse 28 of Deuteronomy, pretty precisely. You get what you need. And it takes you a while, in answer to your question, to discover or to learn that you really do have what you need. You need a certain amount of love in your life. You need people that you love and who love you. You need to have the confidence, I can do these things. I can be useful. I can contribute. You need to have people turn to you, and you know that you're going to be there when people turn to you. All these experiences, you need to study some things. You need to know there's a lot of wisdom out there. Aside from the horrors that are out there, there's also a lot of kindness out there and a lot of wisdom. So when you accumulate all these kinds of knowledge, you realize that you do have what you need, and then you can say, as Moses teaches us we should all say, the choice is there. Choose life, choose blessing, choose goodness, and you can choose. That, of all the things the rabbis could have had us read every year right before Rosh Hashanah, that was genius to have us read that every year right before Rosh Hashanah, to reassure us, you can make tshuva, you can be better, the world can be better. You need to have this all the time. Yeah.
So even though there is so much that is unknown, that doesn't stop you from positing particular claims about how you perceive God to function or exist within nature and within history. Although I love that you wrote, the eye of faith discerns divine activity that cannot be demonstrated empirically. Right? So you might not have an empirical proof for what I'm about to read, but I want to read to you your own words and then have you comment on them.
This is scary.
Yeah. Right, okay. It's from a section in which you are describing the ways in which you perceive God's role as unfolding in history, right? Because it's not all unknown, right? There is that which you are willing to ascribe God's fingerprint to, but you do it in several different ways. So, number one, we should continue to hope for God's help, which may come and perhaps does come in a form that we do not recognize. Number two, we are encouraged to trust that a larger force is at work in the world, perhaps in part through human beings like you and me. And number three, we are commanded to act as if the world depends on us, on all of us, individually and together. Whatever God's part in reducing suffering, countering evil, our role in mitigating suffering and combating evil is indispensable. So could you share a little bit more about what you understand to be as God's movement in the world from the inside and from the outside?
I'm very hesitant in making any statements like this because we just don't know what it looks like from God's side. We only know what it looks like from our side. And from our side, nothing is clear, but there are moments there are moments of great clarity. So let me say two things there. First, I'll tell a story. I don't want to embarrass my daughter, but the high point of my religious life was watching my daughter be born. So we're at Tadassa Hospital on Mount Scopus, and it's like 1 o'clock in the morning or something, and my wife has just gone through labor, and I had the better view, right, of what was going on, and they washed Shuli off and gave her to me, and I did two things spontaneously without planning. I danced around the room. You already know that I like music, so baby, baby, I hear a symphony. And I said uncontrollably, thank God, thank God, thank God. So you could not have convinced me then, and you could not convince me now that Eisen and I did that ourselves, had that baby ourselves. I don't know what that means, but I've taught Martin Buber's book, Moses, many times, and Martin Buber, in a beautiful chapter about the crossing of the Red Sea, says that miracle is not the suspension of the order of nature. Miracle is when the normal cause-effect nexus of nature becomes, as it were, transparent. You see right through it to the soul power, S-O-L-E power, who stands revealed there. And I understood that passage much better after watching Shuli be born, because I had reviewed my high school biology text. I knew something about reproduction, and Eisen and I took Lamaze together. And yet, at that moment of birth, you could not have convinced me, as I said, that the scientific explanation was the only one possible. There was God there. There was God there. And Buber says the second aspect of a miracle is you don't just have the astonishment for the moment that it happens, you abide in the astonishment. And to this day, I abide in that astonishment. So there are certain events in your life that happen which astonish you, and you don't let go of them, despite all the things that press upon you to let go of them. You hold on to them. You can't prove anything. We're not here to prove things. But that is a piece of evidence. And there are certain events that happen in history that seem so incredible, and they match up with the promises of what history should be, that you say, okay, maybe that was God there. But I am determined, as you'll find out if you read the book, I cannot abide the kind of theology which blames God for the terrible things that happened in history. When the Satmar Rebbe blamed God for the Holocaust, God was mad at Reform Judaism and Zionism, so God killed 2 million children. That's obscene to me. Right? And it was driven home for me, not only by my reading, but I happened to be part of an interfaith group that met in Jerusalem. It met in the Sisters of Zion convent that overlooks the Temple Mount, for those of you who know that place. And I got really friendly with an American Catholic priest who happened to be visiting. Right? And we actually read the Gospel of John together. It was a really powerful experience to read the Gospel of John with a Catholic priest. The Gospel of John is the most anti-Semitic of the 4 Gospels. And one time he said to me, when he thought I could hear this, and he said this to me as a friend, you Jews will never understand the Holocaust until you recognize that this is your lot in the world, to be hung on the cross perpetually. And I recoiled in horror. That's not my vision of how God loves the Jewish people, right? So I won't see God in history that way. This is a mystery we're not going to understand, but let's try to let God in wherever we can, despite the fact that things are often terrible. And I don't know, people ask, how can you bless God for the good stuff and not blame God for the bad stuff? I don't know the answer to that question. We should admit, these are things we don't know. But I think we should say thank you. And if you would ask me, Morris, I'll answer a question now you didn't ask me, but which I like to answer.
It was my next question.
I think the origin of my piety is that my dad was a victim of the encephalitis epidemic in the United States in the 1920s when he was a teenager. And he survived after being in a coma for like 2 weeks. And he made a vow of thanksgiving to God, and every day for the rest of his life, he thanked God for being alive. And so I was the heir, as a kid growing up, to that story and the witness to that thanks. And to me, that's the fundamental move you make. Yeah, Heschel says it's wonder and awe and mystery, and that's important too. You can't do without wonder and awe and mystery. But gratitude is the beginning of it, I think, to assume that nothing is owed us. Nothing is owed us, right? Everything is a gift. And the question is, how are you going to use this gift as best you can? And so you apply all of your thought and your experience and your soul to this question. And you try to live as best you can, knowing what you can know and doing what you can do, and not getting stopped by the boulders of doubt and hatred and scorn that stand in front of us.
You use the term in your book when describing the scene of Shuli's birth of abiding in the astonishment.
Yeah, abiding in the astonishment.
Abiding in the astonishment, which is such a...
It's Buber.
You were quoting Buber. I'm quoting you quoting Buber.
Okay.
Right? That part of our spiritual life emerges from not just the moment of astonishment, but abiding in the astonishment, carrying it forward. Yep. I think part of what I was after in my last question is that, and I think this is actually one of the voices that you are responding to in your book throughout. It's the voices of one of your friends who's written you one of the letters in the beginning, who understands God's activity in the world as happening entirely through us. Right? So we are God's hands, we are God's mouthpiece, we are God's legs that march for justice. I forget if this was the friend who's a doctor, right, who sees divinity in the healing of patients, but also struggles with divinity because of the moments in which the patients don't come through to the other side. But your theology goes further than just celebrating or naming a God who works in and through us, that there is also a transcendent God who works outside of us. And we might not understand fully what the nature of those workings are, but you are unwilling to dismiss, you maintain that aspect of God's presence in the world. I think that there's something intuitive, for me, just speaking personally, there's something intuitive about the God who works through us, right? And that in many ways, this projects God as deeply vulnerable and dependent on human beings to actualize God's vision of the world. I understand that God, and I strive to be in partnership with that God. But what about the God who works outside of us, who works independently of us? How do we understand that God? How do we discern that divine activity in the world?
No, I don't think those two things are contradictory. In other words, the God who works through us has this aspect of transcendence as well. But the part that is independent of us is very difficult to see, except possibly in nature. But nature, as we understand it, at our point in time, is not this orderly procession of the stars through the heavens that our ancestors thought of it as, right? We know nature as an endless process of destruction and chaos and marvels that are happening, but with such incredible, who knows, right? I mean, remember the Webb telescope pictures that came out a couple summers ago? That for me was another transformative religious experience. And it was at once ennobling that here we were able to see light that no human being had ever seen before, but also incredibly humbling. Here we are sitting in this room in an inconspicuous little planet circling around a star in a minor galaxy that, what do we know? What do we know about this God? And so I can't talk about that. So you say I discern it. Yes, I discern it in faith. My tradition is there. But my sense is, from my experiences, that something comes into us that's not entirely from inside of us. That's the experiential piece. And I think it's shared by many artists who testify, right, the whole notion of inspiration. And you read the book, so you know that I was incredibly moved by Martin Luther King's story from the Montgomery bus boycott days, when he was so full of terror because he was getting death threats, not just for himself, but for his family. And he thought he couldn't go on, and he gets down on his hands and knees and prays, and something comes into him from outside as a result of that prayer, and the house is indeed bombed, and he's able to meet the challenge with courage and go on and lead that movement, and then lead the movement for another, 13 years until he's actually assassinated. He experienced that as from the outside, and occasionally I have these experiences, and I think they're not just from inside. So there's something, you want to call it a force, I don't know, but even if it's an impersonal force, to do a 20-second bit of heavy-duty theology here, which I do a little bit in the book and almost apologize for.
That's not what we've been doing, heavy-duty theology?
No, we've been doing personal reflection.
Okay, I got to go back to school.
Spinoza, who really did think he was the smartest person alive at his time, and he figured out things that no human being had ever figured out before. What I learned, there's not very much I can understand from Spinoza, you understand, but what I did get was, he said that God has an infinite number of attributes, and I know 2 of them. That is really a gift, I think, from Spinoza to all of us. The 2, by the way, were substance and thought. Substance and thought. And I take away from that God has an infinite number of attributes, and I've experienced a few of them. And I would never say that personality and consciousness and intention cannot be divine attributes. How would I have the chutzpah to say that? Right? I can't. So but there are certain things that I have experienced, and you talked about the most important one when you introduced me during services, most important one being love. And when love courses through us, through the universe, does that love possibly have its source outside of us? Well, our tradition testifies to that all the time. And if I could just, one of the things that writing this book taught me was sometimes to read Torah differently. Like I had insights from the writing of it that changed me. And one of the prayers that I've been saying since I was a little kid that I started reading differently was the V'ahavta. And I'm now going to share with you, because this to me was the most important discovery about the prayer book that I made while writing this book. I realized that in Hebrew, the word et is not only the word that stands before direct objects. So love the Lord your God. So the et, right, is that word that comes in the middle between ahavta and Hashem. The word et means with. So I started reading the V'ahavta as if the V'ahavta says, and you shall love with the Lord your God, with all your heart and all your soul and all your might, understanding that the love that you're sharing somehow has an origin, which you can't explain, I don't know what this means, in divinity. And then what occurred to me is, I never thought about this before, of all the words that the book of Deuteronomy could have used to describe God in the Shema, why did they pick Echad? I say they. Whoever wrote this. Inspired by God, I assume. Why is the word there Echad? We know that that's important. We don't know exactly what the Echad means. One, unity, whole. But again, without being able to understand what I'm about to say, I'm convinced that our ability to love with all our heart, all our soul, all our might, as I put it, our allness is connected to God's Echadness. Again, I don't know what that means, but it seems to me it's true. And I share that with you in that spirit, a reflection by a human being who doesn't understand, but is committed to this. And so when we love, we really are doing God's work.
I was hoping you were going to share the V'ahavta teaching. I underlined it 4 times in the book. V'ahavta et Adonai, love with God. Thank you for sharing that here. I think this is the appropriate time to open it up for some questions from the community. I think Susan has an additional microphone, so Doris, please.
Hi, I'm Doris Goldstein. You went pen with my husband, Jeff. There were 8 people in your class in religious thought. There was you and Jeff, but another Jeff Goldstein, and 5 other people that he can't remember at all. I enjoyed the little passage that was read during services. We're at the same place in our life, and I am looking forward to reading the book. And I am grateful to know that he is not the only religious thought major who cannot articulate readily his vision of God, that this is a frequent discussion that we have, that I will say we've been married almost 48 years, and I'm going to go to the grave not knowing what you think about God and you're a religious thought major. So we're going to read the book together, and then we're going to discuss it, and either he'll have an answer after that, or I will say, are you okay with Arnie's vision? And he'll shrug and say, yeah, okay. And that'll be that, and I'll have the answer. So thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Wow. It doesn't lend itself to one sentence or one paragraph answers, right? Yeah.
Barbara.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. How important is the awareness of death to our pursuit of God?
Well, as you'll find out if you read the book, the awareness of death is not something I have a choice about. For all sorts of biographical reasons, which I felt like I had to share in the book because I want you to understand who I am. So it starts with the fact that when I was a kid, my mother had 2 boys born after me, and they both died. They were born prematurely. And in the 1950s, they couldn't save them. So I grew up with the consciousness that I was a survivor of, right? And there were so many other experiences. And then I had this experience when I was in Israel right after the Yom Kippur War, where I was visited by the angel of death, not with my announcement of imminent death, but with the announcement that I was going to die someday, which after all my years of studying religious thought, I wasn't aware of. Like I thought everybody else in the world is going to die, but not me, right? So, but where would we be without this awareness? Would we be able to appreciate the moments that we have? Would we be able to appreciate the legacy that we're leaving behind us, right? Would we be able to make sense of this tradition? Certainly not. But one of the things I don't like, and this is, Morris, I don't know if you were going to spare me this or not, but part of what I do, there's a chapter on Yom Kippur, right? The chapter on Passover, a chapter on love and mitzvah, and a chapter on Yom Kippur. And the chapter on Yom Kippur is my struggle with the fact that I love the holiday, love the liturgy, love the music, and cannot stand the message that God is writing in a book who's going to live and who's going to die for another year. I find that abhorrent. It may be true. I can't swear it's not true, but I will not tolerate it. So we have to make something of this liturgy. I think the rabbis want to hit us hard with this awareness that you're talking about. The rabbis want us to live with that awareness, and I suspect there are people in the world who are not like me, who go around with serious constructive repression and don't know that it awaits them, right? And the rabbis wanted to shake us up and let us know that life is precious and we have to use every moment we have. And so they gave us a Yom Kippur that's full of reminders of death, right? So I think it's really, to me, it's central, but I'm the wrong person to ask about whether it's important or not because I can't avoid it, right? I've done a little informal survey of professors of religious thought like me. And most professors of religious thought walk around with an awareness of mortality. And I even discovered after a certain time of teaching at Stanford, I taught there for 20 years, that when 19-year-old students were serious in the study of religion, it was almost always because they had an experience of illness or death in their immediate family. They knew something that other students did not know at their age, and therefore they were taking religion courses. And, it's there. And so I had to make it part of the book because I think you can't speak personally about theology without talking about it. And so there it is. Yeah.
Sean Landris. There are 1,000 ways to preface this question, but I'm going to just ask it directly because I think that I just want to go right to the heart of the question. In your theology, does it matter to God that you personally exist? And in your theology, when and if you talk to God, do you believe that A, God is listening inherently, and that B, there is some obligation to respond? I could couch that in a lot of context, but I thought I'd just go right there.
Yeah, talk about easy questions. Come on. Sean, so first, the answer to the first question is easy. I don't know. I do not know. I do not know. But I'm going to live as if God cares that I exist. Heschel, who I trust infinitely, tells me that God does care that you and I exist. But I don't know, but I'm going to hope so. This is one of the things that's among the mysteries, and I'm going to settle for the revealed things. The revealed things are I have what I need to have to choose life and choose blessing and choose goodness, and I'm going to do my damnedest to do that. But the second question is not simple. So you're asking me how I pray. For those of you who are interested in this question, Art Green, who's one of the great teachers of our generation, has a new collection of essays called Judaism for the World, and he has a beautiful essay in there called How I Pray. It's a gorgeous essay, so I recommend it to anyone who wants to read it. Because Green does not believe in a God who hears prayer, but prays fervently every day, and talks about that. I'm not where Art is. I would never say that I do not believe in a God who hears prayer. I would say, I do not know what it means for God to hear prayer. I do not know what that means. Sometimes I think it's possible. Sometimes I think it's actual. And the prayer experience does not depend on believing that every time you open a siddur or open your heart and say words to God, that God is listening. The prayers are not primarily for God. We could do a whole session on this. What Rambam has to say on this is fascinating to me. But I can give you so many experiences in my life that lead me to two conclusions. First of all, I cannot do without Shabbat. That's why the epilogue is a love letter to the two anchors of my life, Shabbat and my wife. I cannot do without Shabbat, and an important part of Shabbat is tefillah. I love the Siddur. I love the Siddur. I can't imagine my life without the Siddur. The words of that Siddur are everything to me. I see through them. So I look at the world, and I'll see it through the lines that are in the Siddur. So I know that it means everything to me. Second of all, I have had experiences in my life where I believe that my prayers have been answered. Not always in the ways, or usually not in the ways that I would have expected. But I'm just offering witness for whatever it's worth that I believe at times my prayers have been answered. And I'm not talking about, when I say this, I'm not talking about the Western Wall story. So since I mentioned it, I have to talk about it, right? Yeah.
It's a good one.
Well, it's a good story, yeah. I did my PhD in Jerusalem. I went to the West, so I got there in 1975. I often went to the Western Wall. Those of you who were there, you can walk through the old city without being afraid in 1975. It was perfectly safe. And I watched all these people around me at the Kotel praying fervently. And I consistently felt absolutely nothing. I felt no more close to God than I would in Philadelphia, my hometown. So I did something I had never done before. I prayed for a prayer. I prayed for a prayer at the Western Wall. And a little piece of paper comes flying through the air into my hand. It's a piece of paper torn from a siddur. It's Ashrei, which I've already mentioned. The significance of it is the prayer I prayed for was one I knew by heart. I have the little piece of paper in a box in my bureau, the top drawer of my bureau. Does that mean that prayers get answered? I don't know. But that's not my model of how prayers get answered. But I can't not abide in the astonishment of that moment. That was a very special moment for me. It doesn't often happen in life. It happened, right? So I'm telling you about it because you asked.
We're gonna close now with a blessing. I see there are additional hands, but maybe you'll stick around for another minute. You have grandchildren here to play with, so don't stick around for too long.
Morris has my email, so if you want to send me email, I'd be delighted. It's one of the great pleasures of this book is I'm getting email about God and theology from all over the place. Please.
So I want to bless you. First, to thank you for this remarkable conversation. Thank you for coming and sharing your time, which is so precious, with your family out here with us, and for such an honest reflection on theology. I think you speak from a place of humility. You speak from a place of unknown, which is real and which is rare, actually, in the theological discourse. So I want to thank you for that. You mention in the very end of your book one of the tefillot, one of the psalms in particular that you have a particular resonance with, Psalm 27, which we recite. You spoke about this period of time earlier. We recite from the beginning of Elul all the way for 40 days, actually even longer through Sukkot. And in that prayer, we sort of take on the voice of the one who is searching and the one who is hoping to find God wherever God might be, in whatever hiding place God might be. We say, "At panecha Hashem avakesh," for the face of God I search. Al taster panecha mimeni, don't hide your face from me. So I want to bless you that you continue to be resolved in your search for God's face, and that you're blessed with many more moments of finding it. I'm finding it in all the ways that it can be found, in the faces of your children, in the good deeds that you've dedicated your life to do, in the quiet moments late at night, staring up at the night sky, in the depths of your heart with your family, with your wife. And I hope that you find it also in the teaching that you're doing. And I want to thank you that that you've really invited us to join you in that search, to not give up on the search, and to stick with it even when the days feel like you could search and you're not going to know what you're to find. Thank you for motivating, inspiring us to continue with that.
Thank you, Morris.
Thank you. Shabbat Shalom, everyone.
Thank you.